Hi, I'm Rosemary J. Kind, and I'm going to read to you the opening passage from The Blight and the Blarney, which is available as a free ebook download. Please visit my website www.rjkind.com for more information, or find it on your preferred ebook store. A paperback version with additional material is also available. 1852, Killarney, Ireland. Michael Flynn leaned against the twisted wooden frame of the low doorway. The thatch, hanging only just above his head, shielded him from the strong January breeze as he sang. Unlike the words of his song, he could hear his own sweet love moving about inside the cottage, and he was thankful that it was so. For all that, he couldn't get the offer of passage to a new life across the ocean out of his mind. It was a land of opportunity. He had heard it said often enough. Sure, there would be a sea crossing to contend with, but they were buffeted enough by the wind at the best of times. He was certain they could deal with that. Their landlord had offered to pay for them all, but with the Blight all but behind them, Michael wondered if there was still any need to leave their homeland and their extended family. He'd turned the offer down, and that was all there was to it. He shook his head to rid himself of the thoughts, and went back to singing. "Da! Da!" He watched Daniel stumble as he ran towards him. His son was letting out heaving breaths between each shout. Michael put his hands out to stop the boy as he almost ran straight into his father in his blind haste to enter the cottage. Michael rested his hands on the young boy's arms. Days were he'd have swung Daniel straight up onto his shoulders. He preferred to think the boy had grown, rather than that 6 years of hunger had left his own self weakened far beyond his age. Indeed, Daniel was born early during the famine, so of course he had grown, despite Michael having to forage for whatever scraps the hedgerows could still yield to feed them. Being born that first year of Blight, it was a miracle Daniel had survived. Many around them hadn't been so lucky. As Daniel caught his breath, Michael thought that again it was Mr. O'Connor, their landlord, he was grateful to. Mr. O'Connor was a good Catholic man, and as landlords went, that made him unusual around Killarney. "Da!" Daniel pointed back along the lane the way he'd come. "Uncle Seamus!" was all the boy could say between ragged breaths. Without need for more words, Michael could see there was trouble by the look on his son's face. As Daniel recovered his speech, Michael took his hat from its peg behind the door. Eventually, Daniel continued. "There's lots of bad men, so there are. They're knocking the house down." Michael Flynn's face clouded, and he took Daniel's hand. Despite his own anxiety, Michael's voice was gentle but urgent. "Show me." Then, running into the wind, he followed the boy along the lane toward the small parcel of land which was farmed by his wife's brother. The sound greeted him long before the sight. The keening of the women carried eastward on the wind. Men were shouting. By the nature of the din, Michael knew the worst was happening. "You be fetching your ma there, Daniel. I'll go on to them." Daniel nodded and turned back the way they'd come. Michael watched him go, pausing to catch his breath again before continuing down the lane. Michael knew what Eliza would want to do, but he also knew Seamus would take the offer of shelter from her and not from him. Seamus was a proud man, and any charity, even from family, was hard to take. Michael continued until the turn in the lane, where he saw the battering ram already set up on its cradle and the bailiffs ready to act on the instructions they had been given. As he looked on, Michael realised the first strike had already occurred. Peat smoke still curled skyward through the chimney, but part of the wall of the cottage was missing. The table and chairs, the family's only belongings, sat forlorn on the mossy ground to the side of the house. Michael's own brother, Patrick, was already standing on the opposite verge of the lane, with his hat in his hands, as though he were watching a funeral procession. It's a fine day when a man's thrown off the land that's served him as badly as this has. Patrick kicked a clod of soil. Patrick would know well how bad this soil was. His own land bordered Seamus's, though thank God it was owned by another landlord. Michael nodded. Words were useless to stem the tide of injustice which had beset his people these last 6 years, and the centuries before that. Jane? Michael asked. Patrick nodded to a group of women comforting one of their own. Jane sat clutching a baby to her breast as she wept. Even above the din, Seamus's voice carried on the wind. How can I feed my family when you drives us off our land? I'm not far behind with rent. I'll see it right. He was shouting at the bailiffs in a last desperate attempt to save his home, though what he thought could be done about that, the already demolished wall, was a mystery to Michael. The men stood impassive in front of Seamus, interested only in the progress of the demolition. Michael felt the weight of sadness as he watched. He knew his brother-in-law's temper, and anything could happen. In horror, he saw Seamus lift a spade from the ground. "Seamus!" He stumbled forwards towards his brother-in-law. The shout came back, "Leave me be!" Then Seamus was wielding the spade in front of him and charging towards the bailiffs. Enforcement officers grabbed his arms from either side, and Michael rushed forward to take the implement before something far worse happened. A shiver ran through Michael as he watched the battering-ram head being drawn back on its supports again, and then heard the splintering sound as it was driven into the side of the cottage with more force than the simple wattle and daub could withstand. Rubble had been strewn across the clumps of grass around the building, and the cottage's dark interior was exposed to the light for the first time since it had been given a roof. There had been few possessions for Seamus and Jane to bring out before the wrecking began. The table and chairs looked incongruous against the backdrop of the now ruined cottage. Anything that wasn't out now would be hard to salvage. Seamus and his family were being driven from their home, and there was nothing he or anyone could do. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the reading from The Blight and the Blarney, and I hope you enjoy reading the rest of the book. Please, when you've read it, do leave reviews. Reviews really do help authors to introduce new readers to their work. Thank you.